Hi there. Welcome to Reaching People Via Headphones, podcasting in the classroom. My name is Neil Silcox. I'm the Maple League's Faculty Excellence Lead. And I'm really excited to be gathered here today to talk about this. I want to acknowledge that we're joining from all across Canada and perhaps around the world even. But I'm speaking to you today from Chibuktuk, which is called Halifax. This is the unceded territory of the Mi'kma'ki and is under the Peace and Friendship Treaty. And I was recently talking to a colleague about this Peace and Friendship Treaty. And the thing that I'm thinking about most today is that the Peace and Friendship Treaty is at least as much, if not more, about our responsibility to create peace and friendship as it is to our right to peace and friendship. So my invitation for you today is to consider how you might do that with one another. If you'd like, you can please share in the chat where you are joining from. I would love to see it. I'm really excited for today's session with Lisa Dawn Hamilton and Matt Tunnacliffe. Lisa Dawn Hamilton is Associate Professor of Psychology at Mount Allison University. Is that right, Lisa Dawn?
Yes.
Perfect. I said it and then I got worried. Matt Tunnacliffe is a longtime writer and producer for the radio and for podcasts, and an incredible sharer of knowledge. And I'm really excited for this session. So I will throw over to both of you. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Neil. So as Neil said, I'm Lisa Dawn Hamilton, and I am an associate professor in the psychology department. I teach courses on stress, sex, and gender, and neuroscience. And my research is on stress, sex, and hormones. And as I like to say, sometimes all together and sometimes separate.
And my name is Matt Tunnacliffe. I've been producing radio for more than 20 years now. I got into podcasts in 2005 when I was at CBC Radio 3 in Vancouver, producing really one of Canada's first podcasts way back more than 15 years ago now. And since then I was a founding producer on CBC flagship show Q, and then I moved back to Sackville and have been freelancing and working on and off for the CBC and for podcasts ever since. So that's my story. So we'll get into more of it as we roll along. But
thank you, Matt. And the reason that we are here today is because we work together on some podcasts. So I'm the host of an ongoing podcast called Do We Know Things? And it's a podcast that examines things we think we know about sex. And this really stemmed from my deep love of podcasts. So I have been listening to podcasts since about 2010, just shortly after I moved to Sackville. And I always knew that I wanted to have a podcast, and I knew that I wanted it to be about sex stuff because I'm a sex researcher. But I really struggled with the technology around it. I had no idea how to do it by myself. But B, and probably the bigger thing, is just not really knowing how to communicate in a way that is more, I know how to communicate in a way that is more accessible to people, but how to translate my research and research of others into something that's really accessible. And
so to stop you there, Lisa Dawn, this is the hook. This is where we're in a podcast. If this were a podcast, this is where you're trying to hook the listener and say, so Lisa Dawn, tell us something. How did this happen? What is the exciting thing that happened that started this whole thing? Go.
Thanks, Matt. Two things happened. Number one, my partner, who's an audio engineer, moved to Sackville. And so now I had a recording studio in my home. So that is like a very practical reason why I was able to do this. But the second part is I had been really struggling with what kind of a podcast I wanted to create. What would the topics be? How would I be different than the hundreds of other sex podcasts that are out there? And an idea came to me in my human sexuality class one day when we were talking about anatomy, and I had said that there's this thing that floats around, that there's 8,000 nerve endings in the clitoris. And I said how I hadn't actually ever looked into that, but this is a stat that gets thrown around. And then a student asked, well, what are the kinds of nerves in the clitoris? And I didn't know off the top of my head. So I said, let me look into it and I'll get back to you. And that led me down a complete wormhole of realizing that A, we basically know nothing about the nerves in the clitoris, B, that this information has been suppressed, and C, that stat about the 8,000 nerve endings didn't seem to be anywhere in the research literature. And that made me realize, what do we know about sex? How do we know what we know? Where does this information come from? And so that is really what launched the idea of Do We Know Things? I decided I would do a research-based podcast that looked into commonly believed or misunderstood things about sex, where I could delve in and say, what does the research actually say? And I started the idea for this podcast. I wrote the first script for the first episode and then happened to run into Matt at the bar.
I was at the bar and I was just sitting there, and Lisa Dawn's like, hey, you know something about radio. I'm starting a podcast. Do you want to look at my script? And basically, I took home a 15-page script, which was just the first half of the podcast, really. And I'm like, okay, there's something here. And there was something here. I mean, I think, thinking about a podcast, you got to have an idea that works, an idea that you can have multiple episodes about. And what was intriguing about Lisa Dawn's idea was that it was looking at these misconceptions about sex, not in the sort of sex with Sue way, or what, like I don't know how to do it or whatever kind of thing, but real research topics about sex that people that there were no answers for. And I mean, that for me, that was fascinating because we know so much about space or geology and stuff, but there's these big questions about sex, something that most people do all the time, not all the time, most people do some of the time, that we have no research on. So it was or no clear answers on. So this was a fascinating topic to go, but it was a long script. It needed to be focused and chopped down and stuff like that. So I came in and said, okay, let's do this and this and this. And that's how the ball got rolling for the Do We Know Things podcast. And from then we've been collaborating for almost 2 years now on Lisa Dawn writes just all the research and writes the scripts. And I sort of, I often just give a light polish or sort of shepherd it along or change the structure of it and things like that. So how long is the podcast? When did the first podcast air?
First podcast aired November 25th, 2019.
And how many episodes is it?
And we're at 39 episodes.
39 episodes. Yes. It's a lot of stuff. So yeah. So it's a fascinating listen. And I've learned a lot in the last couple of years. But that's how the podcast got started. There was a lot of, when you're starting a podcast, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's all about kind of knowing your audience and knowing what the audience, who the audience is, who you're speaking to. It's also about finding your voice. And Lisa Dawn came at obviously from a research perspective. Trying to broaden that out to speak to other sex researchers, and but also trying to find an audience beyond that as well. So it's been fun working with that.
Yes, and the first time Matt asked me, "Who is your audience for this?" I said, "Everybody."
Right, which is a common misconception. Like everyone in the whole world needs to hear my work because I'm brilliant, kind of right. But it was like that. I mean, because you don't actually think about who you're broadcasting to or who you're trying to talk to, right? That one person that you're trying to talk to on the end of the through the earphones kind of thing. But then we sort of narrowed it down. And in fact, I came into it thinking it would be like Sex with Sue, and there would be more like process questions or whatever kind of thing about sex. But it was once we sort of got into it, I'm like, yes, okay, now I know who this is for and how we're going to proceed from there. So,
yeah, so I was able to hone it down to, and the trailer talks about it being for sex geeks and people who just want to know things about sex. And so that's where I've been able to hone down the Do We Know Things podcast. And
so if you are listening and you are a sex geek, check out Do We Know Things.
Yes, exactly. And I just learned so much from this process and realized how valuable it is to be able to have someone to work with to translate academic research into something that's more accessible. And I really wanted to bring those skills to my students. And so this is why we are here today to talk about doing that process with the students. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And so today we're talking about reaching people via headphones, podcasting in the classroom. And before we get into the details about the course, I wanted to give my contact info. So I'm LD Hamilton at mta.ca, and Matt's contact info, which is Matt Tunnacliffe, matt.tunnacliffe@gmail.com. And these are the logos. This is for Do We Know Things? And then This Is Fine is the student podcast that we created from the Stress, Burnout, and Resilience seminar that happened in fall 2020. So how this came about is I knew I wanted to bring Matt in and bring the podcasting experience to my students. And I read a book that's over here in the corner called Burnout. And it's written by a psychologist and a music professor, or a psychology researcher and a music professor about burnout and stress. And I am a stress researcher. That's what my PhD is in, is stress and sex and hormones. But I learned so much from this book and I thought it was really valuable. And so I decided to create a course around it. And so how the course worked was it was a seminar course. There were 17 or 18 students. And we paired readings from this popular book, Burnout, with academic articles. And each week we talked about a different topic related to stress, burnout, or resilience. About week 3 or 4, I think, Matt came in and did a presentation and provided students with written info about how to, oh, am I not sharing my screen? I'm getting.
I see your screen.
Sorry. Okay, something is wonky on my end. Okay, sorry about that. And Matt, provided info to the students so that they could use that to start writing the scripts of their podcast. And from a more academic perspective, the students picked a topic and had to do a more formal presentation to their peers. And then that was morphed and shifted into a written podcast script. So the actual final product that they were required to do for the course was just a written script. They did not have to record it. Most of them did opt to record it, or if they didn't want to, they gave consent to another classmate, or I think I recorded one and Matt recorded one as well. And so all but one student has their podcast episode publicly available. And one really cool part of this for the students, maybe they didn't think it was as cool as I did, was they got a lot of feedback, which is something we'll talk about in a minute that they maybe struggled with a little bit. So that was the background of the course. But from this presentation, I want you to learn about how I did this with the students, but also just if you're interested in podcasting, some general tips and tricks for things to think about if you want to start a podcast.
So yeah, so that's where I came in to talk. So basically, I talked to the students about what makes a good podcast and how to kind of steer their learning. We'll sort of talk about how it all ended up and the sort of process through it in just a few minutes. But what makes a good podcast is, you really have to think about how. I mean, podcasts are so ubiquitous now. There are the blogs of 2021, right? That anyone can start one. The access, the barriers to making it are very low. But not many people think about how it's done. A lot of people just think, well, it's like a blog. I can just put a microphone up and talk on the internet, which is not podcasting. And I don't realize there are many different kinds of podcasts, or comedy podcasts and fiction podcasts and interview podcasts and panel discussion podcasts and things like that. But we're mainly talking about sort of narrative radio, coming out of radio documentary. And shows like This is American Life and things like that have a sort of storytelling aspect to them. That's what we're kind of focusing on in terms of how I'm defining podcast anyway, for this show and for this presentation. But podcasting is really the most intimate of media, and you don't think about that But once you start to think about it, it makes total sense. It's not something that's filtered through a screen. It's not something that's filtered through a page. It's not something that's it's something that it'll funnel directly into your ear. It's the voice of God, literally, like coming into your ears. That no other media can really come close to that kind of level of intimacy. Not radio. Is often playing in the background. It's often playing on a speaker or something like that. Whereas podcast, for the most part, is funneled directly into your ear, and there's no barrier between it. I talk to students about thinking about, when they're thinking about writing, they're thinking about foreground listening. That again, most radio, even sort of a CBC morning show, is considered background listening because you can kind of dip in and out of it. It's made, short interviews are made for, like, oh, if I miss a bit, I can pick it up, and weather on the ones and traffic on the tens, and you're always constantly on a churn of news information kind of thing. Whereas foreground listening is something that has a beginning, middle, and an end. You listen to a podcast from beginning to end, unless you get bored or unless you skip the ads. So it's supposed to be digested in a big chunk that takes you on a journey. Whereas traditional broadcasting is not like that. It's much more piecemeal. And then we talked about the idea of narrowcasting versus broadcasting. Podcasting is incredibly, because it's 100,000 of them right now. You can be incredibly narrow in your audience reach. Broadcasting's not like that. If you do a segment on the CBC about if you did a segment saying, oh, The Office, the TV show The Office is off the air for 10 years. Let's look at the cultural, it's culturally relevant as ever. Let's look at that in a broad context. Whereas, there's podcasts about The Office which examine one episode for one hour, and then do years and years worth of episodes just on that. So it's you're going after a different audience, one for people who are interested in The Office generally, and people who are totally geeking out in The Office. So that's what's the great thing about podcasting. You can really go deep on one subject and still find an audience out there. So that's the great thing about this. The class is somewhere out there. There's another class that is doing a course on stress, burnout, and resilience, that could find this podcast potentially and listen to it, or someone who's a student that is somewhere else that is listening and can get the perspective of another student that went through this to write a piece on stress, burnout, and resilience. So we talked a little bit off the top, knowing your audience, knowing who it is. We asked all the students to define who their audience was in one sentence, and it was very curious to what they wrote for who their audience was, which was mainly their friends, right, or students or whatever, versus kind of the first draft that they delivered, which was still delivered to academic, written very academic, and still delivered to Lisa Dawn and to the way they've always written, kind of thing. But then the other thing is, and then this goes back to this sort of foreground listening thing, is you have to tell the story. You have to have kind of a beginning, middle, and end to draw people through. That personal stories work well on the radio, because you can relate to that immediately, especially through headphones that way. And then you want to hook the audience, because again, it's not a broadcast media. You can stop a podcast at any time. The first 30 seconds or the first 2 minutes, say, are really crucial in terms of being able to sort of have something that the audience wants to stay tuned for, because if not, they can just, it's a click of your phone away that you can go to the next podcast. So you've got to really concentrate on that first 2 minutes to really make sure that you have something to hook the audience into, so they can come with you on the journey for the next 20 or 30 minutes, or however long your podcast is. So those are just a few things that I focused on when talking with the students about what makes a good podcast. If you are interested in starting your own podcast or working with students and things, these are all good things to keep in mind. So that's a little, and then we're going to listen, I think, to some clips of how it worked out. So yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was muted.
No, that's good. Go ahead. You go ahead.
All right. So yes, we've identified a few podcast episodes. I took one from the stress section, one from the burnout section, and one from the resilience section, just to play some examples and give you a sense of what the podcast.
There were 16 or 17 students. How many students were in the
There was
class?
18 students,
18
and then I think
students,
there ended up being 16 podcasts. Now I can't remember.
yeah, something like that. But these are 3 different examples of some of them. So this first one's about 2.5 minutes long. This is just the opening of one of the podcasts. So we'll listen to that and then we'll talk about it.
Mm-hmm. And Matt, can you verify that it's up on my screen?
It is up on your screen.
Awesome. Here is Shannon.
Catchy theme song.
Sorry, did you say something?
I know I said catchy theme song.
Oh,
Good.
yes.
I like the theme song. I'm not, okay, I'll shut up now. Well, I'll talk to you at the end.
Stress, the dreaded 6-letter word that describes the response we have to difficulties we face while trying to make our way in the world. Magazines are always telling us how to deal with stress. Take a bubble bath, they say. Go to yoga, do some deep breathing. You get the picture. As if all these activities will magically remove all the stress from your life. You must have seen these headlines in lifestyle magazines while you wait your turn in the grocery store checkout line. Not to mention all the clickbaity advertisements we are pummeled with as we try to read the news online. These headlines all tell you that stress is bad. Stress is to be managed or avoided so that we don't drop dead from a heart attack at 50. They would have you believe that all stress is created equal and that whichever way you slice it, you should avoid stress like the plague. But is this actually true? Science says, not really. Hi, my name is Shannon, and I'm a psychology student at Mount Allison University. As a parent, a professional, and a full-time student, I have experienced my fair share of stress. In this episode of This Is Fine, we are going to talk about some of the benefits, yes, benefits of being exposed to stress. Before we go any further, we need to differentiate between 2 types of stress. Wait, what? There are 2 types of stress? Actually, yes, stress can be acute or chronic. Acute stress is characterized by its shorter duration. The stressful thing happens, and then it goes away. A good example is a job interview. Now, I've been on my fair share of job interviews. They have mostly been with panels of high-level pharmaceutical industry type executives, which by itself is kind of intimidating. Every single time, I notice that as I get closer to opening the door to the office where the interview will take place, my heart starts beating faster. My palms get clammy and I start to sweat through the armpits of my suit jacket. Gross, I know. But I have the interview, I'm adequately prepared, and it goes well. I leave the building and the stressful situation is over. Cue celebration with friends. Acute stress is short in duration and often exhilarating. You can see a near future moment when the stress will be over. It is manageable and you have the opportunity to recover after the event. So that.
All right, so that was Shannon's, and that was a great. I mean, that was 2.5 minutes, and it really sets the table well in terms of, first of all, she builds up the thing and then knocks it down, like saying stress, it's all bad, but is it, kind of thing. And then she does a great introduction of herself in 3 sentences. She says, you know, I'm a mom and single, and you know, and then gives her thesis statement, and then at the then goes into sort of more of, you know, defining it, but not saying stress is 2 things, this and that. Like, she defines it with a personal anecdote saying, you know, I get acute stress when I have a job interview, and you learn a little bit more about her. You know, she's in the pharma industry or was in the pharma industry, and so you just learn a little bit. You identify with her right away, and it like, you want to hear more of that podcast, and you want to hear what she goes from here. So I thought that was some excellent writing all the way along. Might have even started with the anecdote about, you know, it's that moment where you you know, you put your hand on the door going into the job interview, you know, you just feel the stress. You could start even there with the podcast and then build it out like that. But I like what she did there. So good work, Shannon.
Yes, and Matt's the expert, so I'll leave it with that. But I do like how she shares information, like academic research information, but in a way that's super fun and accessible.
Yeah, all the research was there, but it wasn't, you know, wasn't like Webster's dictionary defines stress as blah blah blah, right? So it was, yeah, it's good.
Yeah, And so this one was from the burnout section, and Michael's topic was specifically burnout in professions that aren't caring professions. So essentially things outside of nursing, teaching, those kinds of things. So here's a little excerpt from his episode.
So now that you know what causes burnout, let's even name the cars, but that's because they can't return their purchase without the receipt. This, of course,
sorry, that started at the wrong time. 1 sec.
Sure, you don't need to be told the difference between the work done by a neurosurgeon and the work done by the cashier at your local McDonald's. What I am going to tell you, however, is why I think burnout is different in non-caring professions than it is in caring professions. Let's waste no time and get right into it. First, I think it's important to note some of the stresses faced in non-caring jobs. The stress faced by, say, a Walmart customer service rep may stem from someone yelling because they can't return their purchase without the receipt. This, of course, is much different than, say, the stress a doctor faces when one of their patients die. That is not to say the stress is any less real or any less impactful on the person for that matter, but the stress does stem from different places. The stress is different, and as it stems from different places, the stress itself can be fundamentally different. Why is this? Let's look at it on the surface. The stress found in a caring profession is dependent on the well-being of another person. In a non-caring profession, however, for the most part, the stress found is dependent on the convenience of another person. Being yelled at as a police officer because you're giving someone a ticket for speeding is much different than seeing a family break down after you tell them their loved one died in surgery. Again, I want to make myself clear. I'm not invalidating the feelings of burnout experience in non-caring professions. I'm simply saying that it's different. A huge contributor to burnout is feeling a lack of control over your work and life. So, working in a job where your boss is a jerk and unpredictable with discipline or anger can lead to burnout. Or being in customer service where people yell at you all the time, but you have to be nice to them, all while making minimum wage, can lead to burnout.
I'll stop that one there.
Yeah, so I mean, this was a more interesting one. Yeah, there's a lot of repetition in the sort of making the point kind of over and over again, which is all right. I mean, this was a script that was harder to do. You can see the read wasn't as good, the delivery wasn't as good. We can talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about sort of the process of the podcast. But yeah, it didn't really jump off the page in the same way. And again, it wasn't personal to him kind of thing. It was just kind of like, you know, Walmart cheers are different from other. It was just kind of removed in the writing. So
he did, though, still do a great job of using, like, repeating, and throughout the episode, he talks about like different ways of identifying burnout and things like that, and does it in ways with like fun and sometimes quite cheesy examples. And then the final one we'll share is called Building Resilience in Children. And so this was specifically, the audience for this was parents, or is parents.
Let's continue to break down resilience into two conditions so we can fully grasp the subject. The first condition states that an individual is doing reasonably well. So not sitting in your car blasting old school Taylor Swift as mascara runs down your face every single day. The second condition is that you're doing reasonably well in spite of significant adversity. So you're functioning to standards that are considered healthy, which, again, I assume is not crying in your car as you strive to cope and overcome your adverse conditions on a daily basis. With those two overarching conditions in mind, let's look at the adverse condition which leads to a stress response developing through 3 stages. The first stage is your emotional reaction when faced with a stressor. Do you embody Ice Queen Elsa, completely lose control of your magical powers, and turn everything around you into solid ice? The second stage is your ability to calm down from a difficult situation within a realistic time frame. How long does your trek through the snowy mountains last, belting out your woes into the howling wind? The third and final stage is your capacity to recover and continue what you were doing before you were triggered by a stressor. How long does it take you to just let it go?
Yeah, I thought that was just fantastic. That was done on her second or third draft. I remember just sending her one note, which was it's too listy, right? And she just had like like these are lists, but then she sort of added the whole sort of Frozen motif on top of it, and it just completely pops. It's an amazing piece of writing for a student, and I thought it really worked, because if you get too listy in podcasts, you're like, oh, again, kind of thing. It's kind of different from seeing on the page. Like, it's like I could have read this on the page, but this, took the list and made it and took it to the next level. So good work, definitely.
So here's some benefits that I think are useful for bringing student podcasting into the classroom, and whether it is just for their personal use or just for the class, or if it is going to be publicly released. It does help them develop their writing skills. Of course, there are different forms of podcasts. There's interview ones, there's, and this is more, the ones we've done are more narrative. And so they are writing out what they're going to say. I did tell them they could do interviews, but nobody opted to do that. It helps them learn about knowledge translation. So this is a skill that employers are looking for, that is useful for academics to be able to communicate their research to others. And they also get to practice their presentation skills. So if they are recording the podcast, Matt sent out information on improving presentation skills as well, that I think were really helpful for the class. And I know I've really benefited from Matt's presentation skills. Some of my first episodes, Matt was there while I was recording and was just like, slow down. That was kind of the biggest communication. And then finally, they get the opportunity to have lots of feedback, which is a pro and a con, which I'll get into in a second. And in general, it's a fun and engaging way to get them to play with the material that you're covering in class.
Yeah, this was really great. I mean, I don't know if this came up in the intro, but I went to Mount Allison for my undergrad, Maple Leaf represent, but yeah, I never had a sort of project like this. I had, maybe once or twice there was peer review during a essay session, but all my presentations were formal academic essays. I never had something that sort of break like this. So to have this, to say, and it's funny because then I went to journalism school after my undergraduate, and they basically said, all that, take all the academic rigor and all the academic research skills that you've learned, keep those. All the writing that you've ever done, toss it away, or basically to teach you to write in a totally different way. But this got a jump on that. It taught the students to try and write in a different way right off the top, which I think is so totally valuable for going out into the working world, whether it's doing communications or anything really, not just journalism or podcasting or anything like that. So I thought it was a great assignment, and I think the students, for the most part, learned a lot. But we're going to talk about challenges and fun right now, joys and challenges.
Indeed. So one of a joy and a challenge were the varying levels of enthusiasm. And so some students were super on board, super excited, and really gave it their all. And a minority, but some were not as into it, put less interest into it. And so it was a bit difficult to balance that because it was such an interactive part of the course, and having some students being so eager and some being not as eager was both a joy and a challenge. The students also had varying exposure to podcasts. So some of them, like me, regularly listened to them and had a lot of experience. Some had never listened to podcasts. Which was,
I was surprising for this, the plugged-in generation, stuff like that. And podcasts are free and accessible and easy to download. And yeah, that some people had never, ever listened to even one of them. So yeah, it was fascinating to see the level of engagement in the class of what people were about. but yes, it obviously helped the people who listen to it and thought about the medium even before going into the class. I think had a head start on this assignment.
A benefit and a pro and a con, a joy and a challenge, was also the lack of experience with feedback and multiple drafts. So many students were used to handing in a paper, never thinking about it ever again. In this project, they had to go through multiple drafts. It was reviewed both by their classmates, by me, and then also by Matt. And so we were all kind of targeting different things. The classmates were supposed to comment on things like accessibility, but also the content, because they were all in the course. I focused more on the scientific info, and then Matt focused more on the attention grabbing, is it interesting info.
Yeah, the sort of structure of the piece, and did it work, and so yeah, I was surprised. But I mean, I also remember back to my undergraduate where it was the same sort of thing. Like you got back the paper and you checked the mark, and you maybe glanced at the comments that the prof had painstakingly written down, kind of thing. But that was the idea. It's like, oh, and we're done with that sort of thing. This was, you had to go back and you had to redo the paper, and I for some students I did ask for, like, take the thing on page 7 and put it on page 1, and that will make the thing a whole lot better. And then you get a second draft back, and it's exactly the same way. And my biggest comment too was that they couldn't stop citing sources. Like they were addicted to citing sources, and like, I don't want to cite sources. I don't want to say in the book, blah 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 blah, without any kind of context of yeah. So there are obviously you can talk about books you've read, and that's part of the sort of academic mission of the piece, but try and do it in a more interesting way than just trying to cite a source awkwardly at the end of your sentence.
And that is absolutely something I still struggle with my scripts for Do We Know Things. And I would like to say that anything that is boring in Do We Know Things is 100% my fault and not Matt's.
No.
But I still default to like Smith et al.
Right, exactly. I think that's it. That's really ingrown. Anything that's like, you want to say Smith et al. Says blah blah blah, and you're like, no, you need to say there's this author. He's called Smith. He wrote a thing called this. You might have heard of it. I don't agree with it. I agree with it. There's ways of making source citing more interesting.
Indeed. And one challenge also was the balancing the feedback without being too overbearing. And so, like Matt said, he would make a really great suggestion. The students would ignore it. And we had to, of course, allow them that flexibility and creativity, and it's their product. But there was, for me at least, anxiety that this was going out into the world and it was representing Mount Allison and the course and me and Matt. And so there was a bit of an extra anxiety around that. But yeah, or things like some of the episodes had things that, I just would not have included, and I would prefer they wouldn't be included. But and so I might make a comment or offer some feedback about that. But if the student decided to go with it, I had to let it go. I guess I didn't have to, but there was one example that was actually kind of an ableist example that worked really well in the story, but I was like, this needs to go, like, we cannot put this out in the world. So when it was something like that there was a clear hard line, but other things, it was a bit more flexible.
Yeah. I mean, and that goes to the whole editing part of finding the voice. You want the voice to be authentic. Like you want, if someone has a strong belief on that, you want that to be able to shine through in the paper, or else it just becomes too bland. If all the sort of, I wouldn't say personality, but if all the opinion is kind of cut out of it, it becomes really bland and really, it doesn't let the students' personality shine through, and that's what kind of will draw you into the podcast and make you want to listen more and more. So. Mm-hmm.
So I also wanted to offer some practical tips if you do want to do this in your class or outside of class. A key thing for getting good audio is a good microphone and a good space to record. I don't know how much of my background you can see right now. I have a curtain behind me. I have bass deflectors kind of around my space to reduce echo. A lot of people can record in their closet. Most of the episodes for this podcast were recorded at the Mount Allison campus radio station, so at CHMA. And that helps because they have good mics and they have rooms that are designed to record in. But I did want to demo just briefly an example of an episode that was recorded on a student's just like headphone mic at home. You can hear like a bit of more echo in it.
If you have never heard of this term before, let me fill you in. Restorative justice and related practices are and were common across many Indigenous communal groups throughout history.
So in that example, you can hear, I don't know how well it translates over Zoom, but the sound is much more compressed. There's a bit of an echo. And so it just doesn't sound as crisp as the ones that were recorded on a good microphone. For recording and editing, almost all Mac computers come with GarageBand, which you can record and edit in. There's also a free software called Audacity that you can record and edit in. So these are cost-free ways of doing this. If you're making something publicly available, like on a podcast hosting service, that will cost money. It's not that expensive. I think it's like maybe $150 a year, depending on what service you're using. There are some free services, but they usually have a limit of maybe like 3 episodes or a certain amount of data, like upload size. And another thing, if you're wanting to put it out into the world, is it will have to have some cover art. And that's something that you could get students to do, or in my case, the audio engineer, also my partner, is also a graphic designer. So we hired him to do that as well.
Yeah, he was really the third part of this whole, triumvirate that actually the podcast would not have been made in the same smooth way without him. So, shout out. Also music as well. Get your music friends to compose music for you, or you can also find it on the internet as well.
Yeah, there are free audio, like cleared of copyright databases where you can get audio.
But if you listen to a lot of podcasts, you hear over and over and over again. So, yeah. But that's what you need. Oh, and the other thing I don't want is the question that a lot of people ask is, how can I make money on my podcast? And the answer is maybe, I don't know. It's incredibly, that's the problem with low barrier to entry, high way. There's a hard way to make money, as opposed to sort of traditional broadcast where it's higher barriers to entry, easier to make money. Yes, I mean, we were at a podcast conference just before COVID hit, and yes, they were sort of flummoxed on how to do it. But so you are doing this, especially with a class, or if you're starting out a podcast, you don't expect to make money. Use it as a calling card, and I think that that's what the great thing about this podcast experience too, is that it is such a calling card for the students in terms of something they can point to, something they've written and recorded that sounds professional, that they can go out and show employers, show other academics about their research skills and their writing skills and their performance skills. That is unique, really, in terms of what they can take out into the world once they've actually graduated.
Yes, and we want to wrap up with some top tips. So I'll give my top tips and what I've learned from this process, and Matt will give more general tips. So related to the feedback piece is, don't be too controlling. Clearly, this is something I was struggling with, so I'm just reiterating it, like being able to like let it go and be out in the world if that's what you're doing. For the class, I think it's useful to share examples of other research-based or academic podcasts. So one I really like is Dressed, the History of Fashion. So it's 2 fashion historians just talking about fashion history, and it's really engaging, and they have a conversation on every episode. One that's about therapy, which is more just one person talking about therapy, is called Stuck, Not Broken. And so it's a really bare bones podcast. And then one that's more highly produced, I guess, a little bit, but is really funny and is not academics, but it's people with research backgrounds, is Maintenance Phase, which is a podcast about the wellness industry. So having examples that aren't super slick, super fancy, is useful for them to kind of get their heads in what this podcast is going to look like. And then my big thing is, if you want to release the podcast to the public, hire people to help you. So the psychology department in Mount Allison for this course provided the funds to hire Matt, to hire the audio engineer. And so that was really beneficial and saved me a ton of time. But also, I mean, students could potentially do some of the techie stuff, but the math stuff, that's invaluable.
Well, no, I have to say, I mean, audio editing is another skill that, you know, I think we may use more and more in the 21st century. So that is something that is separate, obviously, from kind of an academic thing, but it is easier and easier to do. So and that's like most Macs and most computers now come with audio editing software, so you can play around with it, and it is another skill that comes out of producing podcasts. So yeah, I just have a few tips about if you are thinking of producing a podcast, just think about the medium. I sort of talked about that. What you know, I think that's the first mistake that people make is they don't think about how people on the other end of the internet receive it and think think about it. So think about the narrowcasting versus the broadcasting. Think about the foreground listening, the beginning, the middle, and end of everything like that. We talked about finding your voice. You know, have a voice, have something to say that's interesting. Have a podcast idea that you know, maybe not for a class situation, but if you're looking to start a podcast outside of that is sustainable. I mean, there's obviously limited run podcast series and things like that, but you know, most podcasts, as we learned at our conference a while ago, don't go beyond 10 episodes. You know, Lisa Dawn came up with a list of 40 topics that when she started starting the podcast. So that's the kind of idea of you need a base of ideas to start with, or else you will get to episode 7 and you're like, well, that's about it for that. So do that. And then when it comes to writing, when it comes to just presenting yourself, be direct. You know, try not to get in the weeds. You know, with academic writing, you're talking to a potential larger audience over podcasting. Be personal, because those personal stories really make the show go. Be focused, try not to get out on big tangents. And finally, end on a high note. This is both a kind of a meta note, both on that, you know, most podcasts should take someone on a journey, and then you leave them in a better place than where you were, and hopefully in a happier place than where you were. Who knows? And so end on a high note, and that we're also trying to end on a high note here because this is the end of our presentation. So hopefully we end on a high note here. Lisa, we have one more slide. Is that right? We do. There we are. The contact info. Oh, muted.
I just wanted to share also, so in the podcast, if you listen to them, it says that the scripts for them are available on the psych department website at Mount Allison. That is no longer true because we just updated our website a couple of weeks ago. I am slowly but surely transferring them over to Do We Know Things website. So there'll be a new link, which exists already, which is doweknowthings.com/thisisfine. So if it is something you want to read what the students did, that it will be there. And then if you wanted to contact Jeremy, who did all the audio stuff, it's palebluedot.ca is his website.
Yes, and I just want to say also that I'm a freelance writer and broadcaster. So yes, if you want me to consult on anything, if you're starting a podcast for your class, or if you're starting your own podcast, let me know, because I've had lots of experience doing it, and had lots of fun working with Lisa Dawn in her class on these projects. So yeah,
and Matt's help has just been invaluable over the last couple of years, and with the class as well. I think it was really beneficial. So hire Matt. We would love to open it up for questions. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see the chat now. And